Welcome to Tales of Love and Loss in Siena. Tonight's story unveils a journey where passion meets heartbreak. Enjoy the tale. I couldn't sleep for 3 nights after visiting Piazza del Campo, one traveler wrote. Not from fear, but from a profound sense of peace that came after encountering something I cannot explain. The legend of Siena's ghostly bride doesn't inspire terror. It offers release. As we explore her story tonight, you'll experience the sounds of ancient cobblestones, catch the faint scent of centuries-old stone, and feel the cool evening air of Tuscany against your skin. Your breathing will naturally slow as the tale unfolds, guiding you toward peaceful slumber with each whispered word of this centuries-old Italian mystery. The ancient stones of Siena. Have you ever felt history seeping through your fingertips? The ancient stones of Siena hold more than just architectural beauty. As dusk approaches Piazza del Campo, the stones begin their nightly transformation. The sun-baked warmth that radiated intensely during midday gradually retreats. Place your palm against these ancient surfaces and feel the subtle surrender of heat, a gentle release of the day's memories. Imagine your hand running along a stone that still pulses with the warm memory of midday, creating a tactile map that changes with the setting sun. The piazza's distinctive shell-shaped design slopes downward, creating a natural amphitheater within its embrace. 9 segments radiate outward from the lowest point, representing the Council of Nine who governed Siena during its medieval golden age as twilight deepens. A remarkable transition occurs. The square that bustled with thousands of voices hours before falls into an almost reverent quiet. The kaleidoscope of colorful tourist clothing gives way to lengthening shadows that crawl up the brick facade of the Palazzo Pubblico. Street performers pack their instruments, cafe staff stack chairs, and the piazza exhales, returning to a state reminiscent of centuries past. The acoustic properties of the space transform as well. The daytime clamor of voices creates a constant ambient hum bouncing between surrounding buildings. But as crowds thin, individual sounds become both clearer and more mysterious. A whispered conversation from across the square might suddenly seem as close as if spoken directly into your ear. A drop coin rings with unexpected clarity. The shell shape creates unusual sound corridors after dark. These stones have witnessed history since construction began in the late 13th century. They felt the thundering hoofbeats of horses during countless polio races, that twice-yearly tradition where different contrade compete in a bareback race dating back to medieval times. They've supported celebrating crowds and mourning processions. They've endured political upheavals, plagues, wars, and reunifications. Countless secrets have been whispered above them, countless tears fallen upon them. Countless moments of both triumph and tragedy played out across their surface. The thermal conversation between stone and atmosphere creates minute air currents, almost imperceptible unless you're paying careful attention. The medieval buildings encircling the piazza stand like sentinels, their height and placement calculated by architects who understood natural airflow. As night temperatures drop, warm air rising from cooling stones meets cooler air descending from surrounding structures, creating distinctive wind patterns, subtle, localized currents that whisper around corners and along specific pathways. Locals who have spent lifetimes observing the piazza speak of something stranger. Certain sections of stone feel inexplicably cooler than their surroundings, defying expected thermal patterns. This phenomenon is most noticeable in an arc stretching from the Palazzo Pubblico steps, curving across the center and continuing toward the Via di Siena exit. These stones remain cool even on the hottest summer nights, as though touched by something that draws warmth from them more efficiently than natural cooling. Scientists investigating this claim offer various explanations: underground water channels, differences in stone composition, or simply centuries of reinforced storytelling. Yet, thermal imaging reveals temperature differentials that challenge easy explanation, showing a distinct pathway of cooler stone maintaining its pattern night after night. This cooling path traces exactly the route the Bride of Siena is said to walk during her eternal vigil. According to stories passed through generations, her presence draws warmth from the stones as she passes, leaving a thermal footprint that persists even when she cannot be seen. Those who have unwittingly stood in this path often report a sudden, inexplicable chill that seems to pass through rather than around them, a cold that touches something deeper than skin. The effect extends beyond temperature. Those sensitive to atmospheres describe a tangible shift in the air along this pathway, a heaviness or density that feels different from surrounding space. Some report heightened awareness, as though their senses suddenly attune to subtle changes. Others describe an unexpected emotional response, a fleeting but profound melancholy that passes quickly. Local photographers have documented another curiosity. Digital cameras occasionally capture unusual light anomalies along this same path. Not dramatic orbs or mists, but subtle disturbances in how light refracts. Images show slight blurring or unusual clarity following the same arc through the piazza. Professional equipment tests normal elsewhere, yet produces consistent anomalies when capturing this specific section of stone. What's compelling is how these phenomena, thermal differences, atmospheric changes, emotional responses, and photographic anomalies, align perfectly with historical accounts of the bride's final movements. Historical records confirm that a noble wedding procession would have followed this exact route, from the civic ceremony at the Palazzo Pubblico to the cathedral for religious blessing. The cooling path maps precisely to where a bride in flowing white would have walked, her dress brushing stones that now seem to remember her passing. Echoes of forgotten voices. The thermal impression isn't all that remains of the bride's presence. As the sun descends behind Siena's medieval towers, the piazza undergoes a subtle transformation, what acoustic engineers might call a phase shift in the soundscape. The architecture that welcomed thousands of visitors during daylight begins to hold sound differently, almost protectively, as if the stones themselves are listening. Twilight in Siena arrives with its own distinctive symphony. The bells of Torre del Mangia mark the hour with resonant tones that hover in the air long after the striking ends. Vendors call their final offers of the day, their voices carrying particular inflections that have remained unchanged for generations. Restaurant workers arrange outdoor chairs with metallic scrapes against stone, while the receding footsteps of the last tourists create syncopated rhythms against the piazza's surface. The transition between day and night, particularly during that delicate hour after sunset when true darkness hasn't yet claimed the sky, this acoustic tapestry transforms. The unique shell-shaped architecture of the piazza creates natural amplification points, places where sound waves converge and intensify. These concave contours, combined with the specific height-to-width ratio of the surrounding buildings, produce what acoustic engineers call whispering gallery effects in certain sections. These architectural features manifest in curious ways. Fragments of laughter might echo back several seconds after the laughing group has departed. A single word from a conversation returns from an empty corner, disembodied and clear. One American visitor described the experience as having someone whisper in your ear when no one's there. Not frightening, but deeply moving, like being trusted with a secret. As darkness settles more firmly, modern sounds gradually withdraw. The staccato clicks of camera shutters fade away. Conversations grow sparse, then disappear entirely from some sections while continuing in others. The piazza exhales after a busy day, releasing accumulated noise in selective, measured doses standing. In the center during this transition, your breathing naturally begins to synchronize with the acoustic rhythm, inhaling as distant conversations swell, exhaling as they recede. Visitors often report feeling unusually calm, as if the piazza itself is teaching them how to breathe. Local musicians have developed folklore around these unusual acoustics. Certain melodies, particularly those in minor keys with specific interval patterns, are avoided after sunset. One violinist who regularly performs for tourists during daylight hours explained, "There are compositions we never play here after the sun goes down. Not because they're forbidden, but because they don't sound right. The notes come back altered somehow, with harmonics that weren't in the original playing." Sound engineers using sensitive recording equipment have documented these acoustic anomalies, though the recordings typically capture only fragments rather than the full phenomenon described by witnesses. The technical data reveals unusual frequency patterns that challenge conventional acoustic principles, giving scientific weight to the sensory experiences described by thousands of visitors. Most intriguing among these sound anomalies is what locals call il fruscio della sposa, the rustle of the bride. This distinctive sound resembles silk brushing against stone, a soft, rhythmic swishing that follows a precise path through the piazza. It maintains a consistent pattern and tempo, like purposeful footsteps draped in heavy fabric, always traveling the same route. From the steps of the Palazzo Pubblico to the center of the piazza, then toward Via di Sitta. Rustle contains harmonic overtones that more closely resemble human voice than fabric against stone, yet slowed down and stretched into unrecognizable form. When recordings are digitally processed, fragments of whispered words occasionally emerge. These are sometimes accompanied by what sounds like glass beads clicking together, faint metallic chimes of small bells, or distinctive taps of wooden heels against stone. All sounds associated with traditional wedding attire of a medieval Sienese noblewoman. Historical acousticians propose that certain emotional events can create acoustic impressions in spaces with specific architectural properties. They suggest that intense emotional events might leave subtle patterns in how sound waves interact with stone and air. The historical record confirms that Siena's cathedral and piazza once hosted elaborate wedding ceremonies for noble families, complete with distinctive processional sounds. Custodians of Siena's historical archives point to several documented instances of interrupted noble weddings, with one particular case from the late 15th century standing out. Records describe a bride who disappeared during her wedding procession, leaving behind scattered items along the very path where acoustic anomalies are now reported. The emotional intensity of that event, the public scandal, the family's grief, the community's shock, represents exactly the kind of emotional charge that acoustic impression theorists believe necessary to create lasting sound patterns. Sound engineers, who've extensively studied the phenomena, offer a more poetic interpretation. One specialist suggested that rather than thinking of these sounds as recordings of the past, we might better understand them as conversations between past and present. The stones are actively participating in an ongoing dialogue across time. Those who experience these sounds report a strange sense of emotional connection, not fear, but a profound sense of empathy. They describe feeling as if they've briefly shared in someone else's experience, touching an emotion that, while not their own, feels intimately familiar. Sense of centuries past. This sensory experience doesn't end with sound. When night pulls its veil across Siena, something extraordinary emerges that scientists struggle to explain, a fragrance that by all laws of chemistry shouldn't exist anymore. As twilight settles over the piazza, the familiar evening scents of Siena, simmering ragu, freshly baked bread, sun-warmed stones, espresso, and distant garden herbs create the expected olfactory landscape of a Tuscan evening. But on certain nights, particularly humid evenings when atmospheric conditions are just right, these ordinary scents recede, giving way to something altogether different. Visitors describe a perfume that arrives suddenly, as if someone unseen has just passed by. What makes this scent remarkable is its composition, a formula that perfume experts confirm hasn't been commercially produced for centuries. The mysterious fragrance contains notes that modern noses rarely encounter. At its heart lies ambergris, that precious substance once more valuable than gold, harvested from sperm whales and used as a fixative in medieval perfumery. Its distinctive marine musk forms the base note. Rising above this foundation are dried damask roses cultivated in Siena's medieval gardens, with their unique intensity that no modern cultivation has replicated. Most curious is a spice note that perfume historians have struggled to identify with certainty. Some believe it's a variety of Italian saffron that went extinct during the agricultural shifts of the 17th century. Others suggest it might be a particular preparation of wild fennel pollen harvested only during specific lunar phases. Whatever its precise identity, this elusive note gives the fragrance its distinctive character, at once familiar yet impossible to place in any modern context. Medieval perfumery in Siena served as an olfactory indicator of social hierarchy. Noble families commissioned unique scent signatures, with certain ingredients reserved exclusively for those of particular rank. The rarest components created olfactory markers of status, as clear to medieval noses as designer labels are to modern eyes. For noble weddings, custom demanded a unique perfume created specifically for the bride, meant to be worn only on her wedding day and preserved for anniversaries. These bridal fragrances contain carefully balanced components to complement the bride's natural scent while projecting her family's wealth and influence. Standing in the piazza on a quiet evening, encountering such a fragrance begins with confusion, a scent simultaneously ancient and alive, disconnected from any modern reference point. Unlike museum artifacts behind glass, this is a living encounter with history that engages directly with your senses. Your rational mind insists it cannot exist, yet your olfactory bulb processes it, sending signals your brain struggles to categorize. The fragrance's movement through space deepens the mystery. Unlike ambient scents that permeate an area evenly, this perfume follows a distinct path. It appears first near the steps of the Palazzo Pubblico, then moves in a precise arc across the piazza toward Via di Città, drifting like a ghostly waltz across the ancient stones. It never lingers, instead traveling as if carried by someone walking at a measured pace. The municipal archives of Siena contain records of a particular perfume commissioned in 1472 for what was to be one of the city's most significant social events, the wedding uniting two powerful banking families. The perfumer's invoice lists rare ingredients imported at great expense: ambergris from the Atlantic, Damascus roses, precious spices from eastern trade routes, and certain native aromatic harvested during specific lunar phases. What makes this historical record particularly intriguing is a notation indicating final payment was never made. The wedding celebration having been interrupted by unforeseen tragedy and thus never completed. The perfumer's apprentice, however, recorded the precise formula in his private journal, noting it was the most exceptional creation of his master's career that in the 1980s, perfume historians from Florence's Officina Profumo Farmaceutica di Santa Maria Novella conducted research into historical Tuscan fragrance compositions. When interviewing Sienese residents about the mysterious scent, they were struck by the consistency of descriptions across decades. Comparing these accounts with historical formulas, they identified striking similarities with the documented bridal perfume created for a daughter of the Piccolomini family in the late 15th century, a young woman whose wedding ended in mysterious disappearance rather than matrimony. Dr. Elena Bianchi, who led the research, noted, "What's remarkable is the fragrance's composition, which matches historical records with uncanny precision, and the timing of its appearance. The scent is most commonly reported during the same seasonal conditions when this wedding would have taken place. Whether you seek scientific explanations or supernatural ones, this time-displaced fragrance reveals something profound about how memory and emotion might imprint themselves on physical spaces. Perhaps certain combinations of humidity, barometric pressure, and temperature release molecular traces preserved somehow in the ancient stones. Or perhaps, as some locals believe, the emotional intensity of that long-ago day created an impression that transcends our conventional understanding of physical reality. 5. The temperature of absence. The physical world follows patterns, predictable and measurable, until it doesn't. In Siena, where science meets mystery, an invisible corridor of cold cuts through the warm evening air, moving with what seems like purpose and intelligence across the ancient stones. As twilight descends on Siena, the city surrenders to natural thermal patterns. The sun-baked stones of the piazza begin their slow release of heat, creating a gentle gradient as air and stone temperatures gradually equalize. Physics dictates that heat should dissipate evenly across similar materials, with minor variations based on exposure and composition. The warm breath of stone mixing with cooling air creates the comfortable microclimate that makes Italian evenings so pleasant for outdoor gatherings. Yet something disrupts this expected pattern in Piazza del Campo. For decades, meteorologists have documented an anomalous cold zone that appears nightly when the cathedral bells toll 9. The cold doesn't radiate from a fixed point, but travels along a specific trajectory through the square. Temperature readings showed drops of 5 to 8 degrees Celsius compared to surrounding areas, creating what local researcher Professor Antonio Mazzini calls a thermal impossibility that defies conventional atmospheric science. The historical record confirms this is no modern phenomenon. In 1786, naturalist Giovanni Targioni Tizzetti documented experiencing a most unnatural chill that moved like an invisible procession of winter air. Elizabeth Graham in 1832 described a corridor of December frost amid August heat. By 1904, the city council investigated complaints about the moving cold spot, searching for non-existent cooling pipes beneath the square. "We've measured this phenomenon for 20 years, notes Mazzini. The cold spot follows identical timing and pathways regardless of seasonal conditions, wind patterns, or humidity levels. It behaves as if it has intention." Modern scientific investigations have yielded compelling evidence while deepening the mystery. Professor Laura Belli's 2015 University of Florence study utilized advanced thermal imaging equipment, expecting to find a rational explanation involving architecture or geology. Instead, she explains, we captured footage of a distinct thermal anomaly moving at a consistent pace of about 1 meter per second along a predetermined path. The cold spot maintains its integrity even when crosswinds should disperse it or when the square is crowded with people. The cold zone's route reveals a striking coincidence with local legend. Beginning at the steps of the Palazzo Pubblico, where noble wedding ceremonies once took place, the temperature drop travels to the center of the shell-shaped piazza, then proceeds toward Via di Sitta, the traditional route to wedding feast locations. This path precisely matches accounts of a grief-stricken bride's final journey through the square after learning of her lover's death. Experiencing this phenomenon is distinctive. The sensation begins with a prickling awareness as evening air around your ankles grows unexpectedly cool. This chill climbs gradually, enveloping you in air several degrees colder than just a step away. The cold has a crisp, penetrating quality like winter mountain air rather than cellar dampness. Many report feeling gentle pressure, as if something unseen moves past them. Maria Contini, whose family has operated a cafe on the piazza for 3 generations, observes, you can always tell when someone experiences it for the first time. They stop mid-stride, look around confused, and often rub their arms against the sudden chill. Some try to follow it. Others step aside, as if making way for someone to pass. Most remarkable is the cold spot's consistency and resilience. It remains detectable during crowded summer festivals, though less pronounced, and still registers as an intensified chill zone during winter months. Historical meteorologist Dr. Paolo Venturi notes that whatever creates this cold corridor has remained unchanged since at least the 18th century, and likely much longer based on folkloric accounts. The emotional impact on witnesses proves equally consistent. University researchers conducting psychological surveys document patterns of reported feelings, an acute sense of isolation, awareness of absence, and what many describe as borrowed grief. Dr. Elena Ricci, who specializes in psychological responses to environmental stimuli, explains, people describe feeling a wave of emotion that doesn't seem to belong to them. Specifically, the sensation of searching for something irretrievably lost. These reports are remarkably consistent across cultural backgrounds and prior knowledge of the legend. Professor Matt Siena, after decades studying the phenomenon, offers, we understand how temperature works. We understand how grief works. But perhaps we don't yet understand how intense emotion might imprint itself on physical space. The bride's sorrow may have created what we might call an emotional scar on the location itself, a persistent echo of her absence that manifests as physical cold. Whether seeking scientific explanations or embracing the supernatural, those who encounter the moving cold of Piazza del Campo often find themselves walking in ancient footsteps of profound grief, momentarily connected to centuries-old sorrow that continues to make its presence felt in the most tangible of ways, a chill that touches both skin and heart, inviting you to wonder what it might feel like to encounter this spectral trail of tears on your own evening walk through Siena's historic square. A glimpse of white. Human vision transforms at twilight. While direct eyesight diminishes, our peripheral vision, designed to detect motion and contrasts, becomes unusually sensitive. This biological quirk explains why hunters and soldiers rely on side vision to spot movement in low light. But in Siena's Piazza del Campo, this natural phenomenon takes on an unexplained dimension. Since at least the early 1800s, visitors to the piazza have documented a peculiar visual pattern. During The transition between day and night, particularly when the cathedral bells toll for evening prayers, hundreds of unrelated witnesses from diverse backgrounds report glimpsing the same figure in their peripheral vision, always in white, always following the same path, and always vanishing when directly observed a doctor. Marcella Bianchi, a neurologist at the University of Florence who specializes in visual processing, has collected over 300 first-hand accounts. What makes these sightings remarkable, she explains, is their consistency across cultural and linguistic barriers. Japanese tourists, American college students, and Italian locals describe identical visual fragments despite having no knowledge of the local legend. These sightings share striking similarities in their fragmentary nature. Witnesses report disconnected elements that appear only at the edges of vision. A wide white sleeve sweeping around a corner, delicate lace fluttering in the last light, silk embroidered with pearl beads shimmering like a beacon at the edge of sight. These glimpses typically last less than 2 seconds, just long enough to register before vanishing when one turns to look directly. As twilight falls, our vision enters a transitional state where white objects become particularly prominent against darkening backgrounds. The high contrast between white and the weathered Siena stones creates ideal conditions for what we call edge detection, notes Professor Antonio Landini from the University of Siena. Combined with the piazza's unusual lighting patterns, where shadows form in unexpected locations due to the shell-shaped design, we have perfect conditions for visual anomalies. Imagine yourself standing near the font Gaia as the sky deepens from azure to indigo. The piazza has begun to empty, the day's crowds thinning as restaurants fill for dinner. As you gaze toward the Palazzo Pubblico, something catches your attention beyond your direct line of sight, a flash of white that seems to glide rather than walk. Your head turns instinctively, eyes searching, but the space contains nothing unusual. Yet the certainty remains. Something was there, draped in white. This experience has become so common that local artists have developed a unique approach to capturing it. The Spasa di Siena art movement, pioneered by painter Lucia Martinelli in the 1970s, creates work specifically designed to be viewed indirectly. Her most famous piece, Peripheral Bride, appears to be an abstract study of the piazza when observed head-on. However, when viewers focus on adjacent paintings while keeping Martinelli's work in their peripheral vision, the distinct outline of a woman in a flowing white gown emerges. I'm attempting to recreate an authentic Sienese experience, the way our bride chooses to be seen, Martinelli explained in a 2005 interview. Among the reported sightings, one particular vision recurs with remarkable frequency. At least 73 documented accounts describe a white-clad arm extending outward from behind the font Gaia, fingers splayed as if reaching desperately for someone in the crowd. This gesture appears most commonly during July and August evenings, coinciding with the Palio racing season. Historian Chiara Salvini from the Sienese archives has uncovered documents that may explain this apparition. Wedding records from 1472 include unusually detailed descriptions of the bride's attire, she notes. The Piccolomini wedding gown featured manicottily angelic sleeves, an elaborate style with extended sleeves that fell beyond the hands, trimmed with costly Venetian lace and pearl embroidery. This distinctive silhouette would have instantly identified the wearer's noble status. The records describe the gown as bianco come neve fresca, white as fresh snow, an unusual choice when most wedding dresses of the period featured rich colors displaying family wealth. The bride's preference for pure white was noted as peculiar and reminiscent of burial garments by one chronicler, a comment that proved unintentionally prophetic. Fashion Historian Eleanor Connie observes that the wide-sleeve design created a dramatic visual effect when the wearer extended her arms. The sleeves would open like wings, displaying the intricate embroidery inside. This reaching gesture would make her immediately recognizable, even from a distance. Psychological researchers have noted an intriguing pattern among witnesses. Dr. Paolo Ricci has interviewed over 100 people who experience sightings. Most describe a profound emotional response, not fear, but a deep sense of compassion and an urge to help someone who is searching. This emotional resonance may explain why the sightings persist despite technological advancements. Even as smartphone cameras proliferate throughout the piazza, the bride remains elusive to digital capture. Photography professor Gabriella Esposito explains, "The human eye has capabilities that even our best cameras can't replicate, particularly in transitional light. Our peripheral vision operates at effectively higher frame rates than central vision, allowing us to detect motion that happens too quickly for both conscious perception and camera sensors." The forbidden love. While cameras fail to capture her image, historical records reveal something cameras could never show: her heart. Behind the ghostly figure glimpsed in Siena's twilight lies a forbidden passion that defied the rigid social boundaries of medieval Italy, one where love and art intertwined in secret, while powerful families negotiated marriages like military treaties. In 15th century Siena, noble daughters weren't asked who they wished to marry. Their hands were bargained over in private rooms by fathers and uncles, with dowries tallied like war reparations and bloodlines scrutinized like prized livestock. For the Piccolomini family, their youngest daughter Elisabetta represented a living contract to secure alliances, expand territories, and strengthen their banking empire. Their worlds collided in Siena's market square. Federico, a young artist apprentice from Florence, had arrived to assist with cathedral fresco restorations. Elisabetta and her lady's maid stopped at the same merchant stall where he purchased pigments. The veiled nobleman's daughter questioned him about the vibrant colors displayed on the table. She wasn't supposed to engage with commoners, explains historian Marco Bellini, who discovered correspondence between Elisabetta's lady's maid and her cousin. But from the letters, we learn she had a passionate interest in art that her family considered inappropriate for someone of her station. The maid describes how Elisabetta would beg for details about the cathedral renovations whenever they attended Massachusetts. The cathedral project became their sanctuary. Elisabetta convinced her family she needed additional time for prayer, a request no father could reasonably deny. While her chaperone believed she knelt in the side chapel, she slipped behind the scaffolding where Federico worked. Surrounded by half-finished saints and angels, they discovered a shared language of color, composition, and sacred imagery. Federico offered something revolutionary: conversation as equals. He taught her how certain blues exceeded gold in value, how painting's geometry guided viewers, and how artists encoded hidden meanings. She shared her knowledge of classical poetry, music theory, and mythology illustrated in the frescoes. Their relationship evolved through intellectual connection, notes Dr. Sofia Martinelli, whose examination of Federico's sketchbooks revealed evidence of their relationship. The margins contained tiny notations in two distinct handwritings: his hurried artist scrawl and her more formal, educated script. They discussed everything from Dante's verses to the mathematical principles behind cathedral architecture. In Siena's stratified society, discovery meant destruction for both. Federico risked banishment or execution, while Elisabetta faced ruining her family's position in Siena's power structure. The risk cannot be overstated. explains social historian Francesca Novelli. Siena's banking families maintained their power through strategic marriages. A daughter who rejected this duty threatened her entire family's standing. Historical records show cases where noble daughters who refused arranged marriages were forcibly confined to convents or even declared legally dead. For nearly 2 years, they exchanged meaningful tokens. A silk ribbon from Elisabetta's hair became Federico's talisman as he painted. He created tiny landscape sketches for her of places they dreamed of seeing together. Venice's canals, Rome's ruins, and Amalfi coast villages. These sketches represented freedom, explains art historian Giovanni Ricci, who identified Federico's distinctive landscapes in Siena state archives. A visual promise of a life beyond Siena's walls where their love wouldn't be forbidden. The precision suggests they were created with extraordinary care as treasured keepsakes. Crisis arrived in spring 1472. Elisabetta's father announced her betrothal to the son of the powerful Ptolemy family, sealing a banking partnership controlling Tuscan trade routes. The wedding was set for midsummer, 2 months away. Letters between Elisabetta's maid and her cousin reveal the devastation. My lady neither eats nor sleeps. She stares at the walls as though they were prison bars, and yesterday I found her pressing a small drawing to her heart, weeping so silently I feared her soul might slip away with her tears. With time dwindling, they formulated an escape plan. Federico secured a position in a Venice workshop far from Tuscan politics where they might vanish into anonymity. He sold possessions and arranged travel permits while Elisabetta collected small valuables, jewelry, gifts, and saved coins to fund their new life. The night before her wedding, Elisabetta planned to escape during her final gown fitting. Federico would wait with horses at the northern gate where guards were less vigilant. By dawn, they hoped to be journeying toward Venice, unknown to them. A cathedral sacristan had noticed their meetings and alerted the Piccolomini family, hoping for favor from the powerful clan. Multiple historical sources confirm what followed. City records show a Piccolomini daughter betrothed to unite with the Ptolemy banking house in June 1472. The contract bears both fathers' signatures with unusually generous terms. Simultaneously, cathedral payment records show Federico della Rovere abruptly disappearing from the payroll without explanation after nearly 2 years of regular mentions in workshop inventories. Most revealing is an entry in Siena's city magistrate journal. Resolved matter of artisan presuming beyond his station. Family honor preserved through discretion. No public action required. These disconnected records provide only the framework of their story, unable to capture the passion that drove 2 young people to risk everything, the dreams they shared in whispered conversations beneath cathedral scaffolding, or the fear they must have felt as their final evening approached. The duel at dawn. The eve of Elisabetta's wedding saw Siena transformed into a tableau of celebration, with streets festooned in the Piccolomini and Ptolemy colors. Yet how quickly can festivity turn to tragedy when honor and love collide at sword point? In the Piccolomini Palazzo, Elisabetta sat in rigid silence as her attendants arranged her hair. The previous night, her lady's maid had whispered a message. Federico had returned. Despite the danger, he had slipped back into Siena after learning of the wedding plans. He would wait at the eastern gate at dawn with horses ready, their last chance to escape together. The first sign that something had gone wrong came with the sudden silence of the cathedral bells. On wedding mornings, they rang continuously from first light, but on this day, they fell silent after the third peal. Minutes later, the sounds of conflict echoed from the city's eastern wall. Shouts, then screams, then the unmistakable ring of steel on steel Federico, had waited at the gate with 2 saddle horses, but someone had betrayed their plan to the Tolomei family. The groom himself, Alessandro Tolomei, along with 3 cousins, confronted the artist. Words were exchanged, harsh accusations of dishonor and theft. Federico, realizing escape was impossible, made his final plea not for his life, but for Elisabetta's freedom. She deserves to choose her own path. Witnesses later reported him saying, "Her heart is not a commodity to be traded between banking houses." Alessandro Tolomei drew his sword. "You speak of what you do not understand. Family, honor is the only currency that matters in Siena." The code of honor that governed such confrontations was absolute. Once swords were drawn, they could not be sheathed without blood. Both men stood trapped by the rigid expectations of their stations, with vastly different stakes. The duel began with formal salutes. Federico moved with the same grace that guided his brush strokes, keeping Alessandro at bay with defensive parries. The scrape of steel against steel echoed between the city walls. Alessandro fought with the confidence of years of training, his technique perfect but predictable. His cousins formed a semicircle, ensuring Federico could not escape. A few citizens gathered at a distance, dawn workers pausing to witness what they recognized as a matter of honor. No one intervened. The artist fought well, a fruit seller later told the city magistrate, but you could see in his eyes he knew his fate. The turning point came when Federico feinted toward Alessandro's left shoulder. As the nobleman moved to parry, Federico slipped past his guard to cut the tassel from Alessandro's sword hilt, a skilled move that humiliated without harming. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. This symbolic victory was Federico's undoing. Alessandro's face darkened with rage. The fight transformed from formal to furious, the nobleman's attacks growing wilder but more dangerous. Their harsh breathing hung visible in the cool morning air. The end came suddenly. Federico's foot slipped on the morning damp cobblestones. In that moment of imbalance, Alessandro drove his blade forward, catching Federico beneath the ribs. The artist fell to his knees, sword clattering on stone, one hand pressed to his side where crimson bloomed against his tunic. As Alessandro stepped back, Federico used his failing strength to reach inside his doublet. What he withdrew was not a weapon, but a small packet of papers. With blood-slick fingers, he unfolded the top sheet. A sketch of Elisabetta, rendered with such tenderness that even Alessandro paused. "She deserved better than either of us," Federico whispered, before collapsing fully onto the stones inside. The Piccolomini Palazzo, Elisabetta sat bolt upright during her hair dressing, as if struck by a sudden chill. When her maid entered with a cup of spiced wine, Elisabetta caught her wrist, demanding news from the city. The maid's eyes filled with tears. "There has been a duel, my lady, at the eastern gate." Elisabetta rose, sending combs and ribbons scattering across the marble floor. She ran from a chamber, still wearing her underdress, her hair half arranged with pearls. She raced through the palazzo corridors, past startled servants and early arriving guests. Outside, she gathered her white skirts and ran through streets already decorated for her wedding day. Banners bearing the merged crests of Piccolomini and Tolomei fluttered above her as she ran, mocking symbols of a union that now seemed like a curse. When she reached the eastern gate, a small crowd had gathered. They parted silently as she approached, averting their eyes, some from respect for her grief, others from fear of witnessing a noble daughter's public disgrace. She was too late. Federico lay still on the blood-stained cobblestones, his body already covered with a merchant's cloak. The sketch he had held lay nearby, partially stained with his blood, but still clearly recognizable. Her face, rendered with love and skill that transformed her features into something luminous. The vanishing bride. Standing over her lover's body, Elisabetta made a decision that would transform her from bride to legend. In the centuries since, historians have debated how a noblewoman could simply vanish from a city where every entrance was guarded and every stranger noticed. Yet the evidence suggests the impossible. The wedding guests had already begun to gather at the Piccolomini Palace when the first whispers of concern spread through the assembled crowd. The ceremony had been scheduled for midday, when the sun would illuminate the cathedral's interior to its fullest splendor. But as the appointed hour approached, Elisabetta was nowhere to be found. Her mother sent servants to check her chambers, expecting perhaps to find her overcome with nerves or engaged in last-minute preparations. What they discovered instead were empty rooms, her wedding jewelry laid out untouched, and the window shutters thrown wide open. The initial concern quickly escalated to alarm. The Piccolomini patriarch, having already received word of the morning's deadly duel, but keeping it closely guarded from the wedding guests, dispatched guards throughout their family properties. Within the hour, as the cathedral bells remained conspicuously silent, the search spread throughout Siena's contrade, with messengers dispatched to every noble house and sanctuary in the city. The family's panic was twofold, explains historian Giulia Moninari. Not only had they lost track of their daughter on the most politically significant day of her life, but they feared what she might have learned about Federico's death. According to Moninari's research in the municipal archives, the Piccolomini family offered substantial rewards for information about her whereabouts. Their correspondence reveals far more concern about the marriage alliance being threatened than about Elisabetta's well-being. By mid-afternoon, the wedding guests had been informed that the ceremony would be delayed due to an unexpected illness in the family. The Ptolemy contingent, still unaware of the morning's events, remained at the cathedral, while members of both families joined the increasingly frantic search. The first tangible clue appeared just before sunset. A street vendor found Elisabetta's lace veil on the steps of the Palazzo Pubblico, carefully folded and weighted with a small stone. This discovery shifted the search to the Piazza del Campo, where a child playing near the Font Gaia discovered one of her embroidered silk slippers. These abandoned items represented a symbolic shedding of her arranged identity, notes folklorist Marco Bianchi. They captivated the public imagination as a deliberate statement of rejection. The most telling discovery came at nightfall. Elisabetta's betrothal ring, placed precisely at the spot where Federico had fallen that morning, atop one of his sketches of Venice, their planned escape destination. This final breadcrumb transformed public sentiment, awakening a collective sympathy for the vanished bride.as. News of both Federico's death and Elisabetta's disappearance spread. Theories multiplied throughout Siena. The Ptolemy family suggested kidnapping by the slain artist's associates. Others whispered of suicide, that grief had driven her to the city walls, a theory the Piccolomini preferred, as it would generate sympathy rather than scandal. Among Siena's common folk, the belief was more romantic, says cultural anthropologist Laura Ricci. They believed she had escaped, aided by friends of Federico who honored his final wish by securing her passage to Venice or beyond. This version became the preferred narrative in taverns and markets. The mystery deepened with witness accounts of seeing Elisabetta at dusk. A candlemaker observed her walking along the western wall, moving as one in a dream, with singular purpose. A vintner crossed paths with her near Porta Camalia, while a wool merchant reported seeing her in conversation with an elderly woman near the northern gate. This elderly woman appears in several accounts, notes historian Montanari. Guards reported no such woman passing through, yet the description remains consistent. A small woman with silver hair wearing a dark blue cloak with embroidery like stars in the night sky. For those who knew Elisabetta, such a dramatic disappearance seemed impossible. Her childhood tutor described her as dutiful to a fault, with no hint of rebellion save her unusual interest in pigments and their properties. Her lady's maid insisted that while distraught about the arranged marriage, she accepted it as women of her station must, with resignation rather than resistance. What transformed this dutiful daughter into someone capable of vanishing? Psychologist Sofia Narini suggests the Elisabetta who ran through the streets to find Federico dying was fundamentally altered by trauma. Witnessing his death likely triggered acute stress response, dissolving normal constraints on behavior. The historical records confirm that in summer 1472, a noble daughter of the Piccolomini family vanished on her wedding day. The financial agreements between the families dissolved with considerable acrimony. The diplomatic fallout altered Siena's political landscape for decades. The banking partnership that would have resulted from the marriage never materialized, leaving both families vulnerable to Florentine competitors. Within a generation, both houses had lost significant standing in Siena's governance. Echoes across cultures. The fall of two noble houses wasn't the only legacy of Elisabetta's choice. Her tale belongs to a tapestry of ghost brides that spans continents and centuries. From the misty valleys of Mexico to the ancient castles of Germany, from the villages of Japan to the mountain shrines of India, these spectral women in wedding attire continue to walk through our collective imagination. What makes these stories so persistent? Why do we find ourselves drawn to tales of women frozen at the moment of transformation from maiden to wife, their futures stolen by tragedy? Answer lies in the emotional blueprints these stories contain. Elisabetta's narrative follows patterns found in ghost bride legends worldwide. She exists in that liminal space, neither fully married nor truly single, caught between two identities, two possibilities of existence. This state of suspension resonates deeply with the human experience of unresolved emotion and transitions interrupted.la. Llorona stands as one of the most enduring ghost bride figures in Latin American folklore. A woman eternally searching for what she has lost, condemned to wander waterways weeping for her children. In some versions, she loses them by accident, in others by her own hand. The parallel with Elisabetta illuminates both tales. Both women lost what they treasured most. Both continue an endless search through the labyrinth of their grief, appearing to the living as cautionary figures and objects of compassion. L. A. Lloronis. Story reveals deeper cultural roots, with scholars tracing connections to pre-Columbian goddesses like Cihuacol, an Aztec deity associated with motherhood and weeping. Ghost bride narratives often evolve from earlier cultural mythologies that help societies process grief and loss. A tradition Elisabetta's tale continues in Renaissance Siena. Across the Atlantic, Die Weiße Frau, the White Lady, haunts numerous German castles and manor houses. Always dressed in flowing white, she typically represents a noble woman who died in tragic circumstances, often related to love or betrayal. Like Elisabetta, these spectral women become intertwined with the physical landscape, creating geographic anchors for emotional narratives. In Chinese folklore, young women who died before marriage might be wed posthumously to balance the spiritual world, while Japanese ghost brides often represent the consequences of societal restrictions on women's choices, mirroring the constraints that forced Elisabetta into her tragic decision. Ancient Greek mythology offers Lamia, who, after losing her children, transformed into a monster, representing how grief can fundamentally alter one's nature when left unprocessed. The persistence of these stories across diverse cultures reveals something fundamental about human psychology. They serve as emotional processing tools, allowing societies to examine painful experiences through the safety of narrative distance. When we listen to Elisabetta's story, we engage with universal experiences of thwarted choices, impossible circumstances, and far-reaching consequences of momentous decisions. Her tale creates a psychological container for emotions that might otherwise overwhelm us. These legends function in multiple ways across cultures. Many serve as cautionary tales, warnings about forbidden love, the importance of honoring commitments, or the power of societal expectations. La Llorona's stories warn children about staying away from water at night, while White Lady legends highlight the consequences of betrayal or pride. They also function as expressions of compassion, acknowledging suffering that might otherwise be forgotten, particularly the suffering of women whose lives were constrained by social structures beyond their control. Elisabetta's circumstances, being bartered as a living contract between banking families, mirror the limited options available to countless women throughout history. The emotional resonance explains their longevity better than any belief in the supernatural. People continue to tell ghost bride stories because they recognize the emotional truth embedded within them. These narratives provide vocabulary and imagery for discussing profound human experiences like grief, regret, and the fear of dying with unfinished business. Bride ghosts specifically represent interrupted transformation. Marriage traditionally marked one of the most significant life transitions for women across cultures, a complete change in identity, status, and often location. A ghost bride is suspended between states of being, frozen at the moment of transformation, making her a powerful metaphor for all human experiences that remain unresolved or incomplete. That Elisabetta's continued presence in Siena, manifested through cooled stones, lingering scents, and glimpses of white fabric, represents the unresolved nature of her story. Like all compelling ghost brides, she continues her search because the search itself has become her identity. This resonates with our own experiences of seeking closure in situations where traditional resolution may be impossible. The therapeutic value of these stories creates safe opportunities to examine our own unresolved emotions. We can acknowledge our fears, regrets, and sorrows while remaining anchored in the present moment, a practice similar to certain forms of meditation. Folklorists have long understood that supernatural tales often serve as collective psychological tools, helping us process complex emotions. This explains why encounters with Elisabetta's presence typically leave witnesses feeling peaceful rather than frightened. Unlike horror-focused ghost stories, bride legends like hers often evoke compassion and reflection. They remind us that behind every ghost story is a human story, one of love, loss, choice, and consequence. 11. The peaceful encounter. The most puzzling aspect of Elisabetta's continued presence isn't that she appears at all. It's what happens to those who glimpse her. Against every expectation from popular ghost lore, these encounters don't inspire terror, but transformation. A grieving widow finds her burden suddenly lightened. An anxious student gains clarity. A troubled couple reconciles after separate meetings with the spectral bride, modern. Paranormal research tends to categorize ghostly encounters as frightening disruptions, cold spots that make skin crawl, disembodied sounds that trigger fight or flight responses, shadowy figures that inspire dread. Yet, contemporary accounts from the Piazza del Campo tell a fundamentally different story. I felt as though someone understood my pain completely, recounts Margherita Donati, a 63-year-old widow who visited Siena 3 years after losing her husband of 4 decades. I was sitting alone near the Font Gaia as evening settled, feeling that particular heaviness grief brings when I sensed someone sitting beside me. There was this gentle pressure on my hand, like someone had placed theirs atop mine. When I turned, I saw nothing, but caught the faint scent of roses. The feeling that washed over me wasn't fear. It was recognition, as if my sorrow had been acknowledged by someone who truly understood loss. Dr. Lucia Monteverdi, who has documented over 200 such encounters since 2005, notes distinct patterns in these experiences. The emotional signature of an Elisabetta encounter is remarkably consistent. Witnesses describe a profound sense of being seen in their suffering, followed by a lightening of their emotional burden. Their grief transforms into something bearable. These encounters typically begin with subtle awareness rather than shock. Sensory elements occur in a consistent pattern. A peripheral glimpse of white movement, a cooling of the air, often followed by gentle physical sensations like a hand on a shoulder or pressure on fingers. Many report the delicate scent of roses lingering briefly in the air. What separates these encounters from typical ghost stories is the absence of malevolence or fear. Paranormal. Researcher Sophia Martinelli suggests this represents an evolution in how we understand spiritual phenomena. Throughout history, we've assigned frightening qualities to the unexplained because fear is a natural response to the unknown. But in Elisabetta's case, witnesses consistently report feeling comforted rather than frightened. The transformative quality of these encounters emerges clearly in accounts from people experiencing relationship difficulties. Paolo and Maria Conti, a couple on the verge of separation after 15 years of marriage, each had independent encounters during a last attempt reconciliation trip to Siena in 2016. Maria felt a presence beside her while sitting alone after an argument. In her peripheral vision, she glimpsed a shimmer of white fabric, followed by a profound sense that some losses can't be undone, but that doesn't mean we should create new ones needlessly. Paolo, unaware of his wife's experience, felt a hand on his shoulder elsewhere in the piazza that same evening. I was suddenly struck by this feeling that I was focusing on all the wrong things in our marriage. My anger seemed petty compared to the depth of what we stood to lose. 5 years later, the reconciled couple keeps a small framed sketch of the Piazza del Campo in their home. The timing of encounters appears significant, with most occurring during transitional states, geographical transitions as people visit from elsewhere, emotional transitions like grief or anxiety, or temporal transitions like dusk when light changes. Psychotherapist Dr. Elena Ricci suggests these liminal spaces may make people more receptive to subtle emotional shifts, perhaps most. Intriguing is the theory that Elisabetta isn't trapped in endless sorrow, but has been transformed by it into something healing. Historical psychologist Marco Ferretti proposes she may have transcended her personal grief to become a vessel for universal understanding of loss. Her presence offers empathy, the difference between "I'm sorry for your trouble" and "I have felt what you feel and I stand with you in it." This resonates with witnesses like Sophia Chun, an American tourist who experienced what she calls borrowed perspective during a chance encounter. "I've been obsessing over a promotion I didn't get, feeling like my life was ruined. While sitting in the piazza at sunset, I suddenly felt this presence behind me and caught a flash of white. In that moment, my problem shrank to its actual size. I felt this calm certainty that what matters isn't what we lose, but how we carry ourselves afterward. Dr. Gabriella Connie suggests the legend creates a psychological space for emotional processing. The specificity of her tale, love, loss, choice, consequence, provides a template through which visitors can process their own unresolved feelings. Unlike traditional ghost stories that exploit fear for entertainment, Elisabetta's legend invites contemplation. Those who experience her presence often report lasting changes in perspective, a shift from seeing problems as insurmountable to viewing them as part of a larger human experience. Eternal search as meditation. Elisabetta's impact as a healing presence raises an unexpected question about her own experience. Could her eternal search be not a curse, but a conscious choice? What if, after centuries of moving through the same spaces, her seemingly endless quest has transformed from torment into a form of meditation that holds surprising relevance for our modern struggles with anxiety and sleeplessness? Consider the rhythmic nature of Elisabetta's nightly journey, a measured path from palace to piazza to street. The consistency of her movements suggests something beyond mere haunting. Walking. Meditation practices have existed across cultures for millennia, from Buddhist kinhin to Christian labyrinth walking. These traditions share a common understanding that the steady movement of the body can anchor and quiet the mind. Contemplative walking embraces the journey itself. This perspective transforms how we might understand Elisabetta's presence. Perhaps what began as desperate searching evolved over centuries into conscious presence. Her footsteps tracing the same route night after night, because the seeking itself has become her practice. Meditation. Instructor Chiara Lombardi notes, Elisabetta's route follows a natural rhythm, beginning with descent from the elevated palazzo, crossing the open piazza, and ending with focused movement through a narrow street. This mirrors traditional meditative practices that guide practitioners from expansive awareness to concentrated focus. Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh described walking meditation as printing peace with each step. For Elisabetta, each footfall across Siena's ancient stones might represent acceptance, a conscious imprinting of peace upon a place once marked by violence and loss. The cool impression she leaves behind manifests this practice, the unchanging nature of Elisabetta's path holds particular significance. In meditation traditions, repetition serves as an anchor for consciousness. The Zen concept of beginner's mind teaches approaching familiar experiences with fresh attention. Elisabetta's centuries of traversing the same stones represent this principle, each crossing new despite being identical to thousands before. Dr. Matteo Ricci, a neuropsychologist at the University of Florence, suggests that repeated physical patterns create powerful mental states. The brain responds to rhythmic movement by activating parasympathetic responses associated with rest. Viewing Elisabetta's journey as deliberate practice transforms suffering into presence. This reframing offers value to those struggling with racing thoughts at night. Our minds often become trapped in circular patterns, reviewing regrets, anticipating challenges, replaying conversations. Like Elisabetta, we traverse the same mental pathways, but unlike her, we resist rather than embrace the journey. Therapist Sophia Martini observes that accepting repetitive thoughts rather than fighting them can paradoxically lead to their dissolution. When we observe mental patterns with compassion instead of frustration, we create space around them. This Practice of witnessing without judgment reflects what Elisabetta might have discovered through centuries of movement. The profound wisdom in Elisabetta's story lies in her transformation of limitation into liberation. Bound to a specific path, she found freedom within those constraints, reflecting the meditation concept of finding infinity in limitation, where boundaries create inner spaciousness. Quiet your own thoughts. Imagine Elisabetta's footsteps across cooling stones. Try synchronizing your breath with her pace, inhaling for 3 steps, exhaling for 3. Each footfall echoes like a heartbeat guiding you into calm. This rhythmic breathing naturally slows heart rate and activates the parasympathetic nervous system, preparing for rest. Following her path in your imagination draws attention away from circular thoughts. This redirection mirrors techniques used in guided meditation to interrupt anxiety cycles. Instead of fighting restless thoughts, you simply shift focus elsewhere, allowing mental agitation to settle naturally. Elisabetta's story teaches carrying grief without being consumed by it. After centuries, she continues, not denying her loss, but integrating it. This models resilient grieving, incorporating painful experiences into our narrative without letting them dominate. The most healing aspect of contemplative practice isn't escaping difficult emotions, but developing a different relationship with them, explains Dr. Lucia Fontana. Elisabetta's continued presence suggests she's neither trapped in grief nor free from it. She's transformed it into something meaningful. Perhaps the most powerful lesson from Elisabetta's eternal walking meditation is that accepting what cannot be changed creates peace. While she never finds what was lost, she discovers a steady presence that brings comfort to herself and others. Her personal tragedy becomes a communal resource. Why? Accompanying Elisabetta through imagination, you practice meditation yourself. Her story has guided your attention toward a single focus, your breathing likely slowing to match her footsteps across ancient stones, mirroring the natural transition from wakefulness to sleep. There's a profound truth within Elisabetta's story that transcends the centuries. Her journey teaches us that healing often comes not from fighting against our sorrows, but by embracing them fully and transforming their energy into something meaningful. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine her footsteps on those ancient stones, not trapped in endless suffering, but finding purpose in her continued path. The peaceful souls have faced their deepest griefs and carry them gently forward. Tonight, perhaps you'll sense those chilled stones beneath your own feet. Feel the whispered fabrics against your skin. Elisabetta's moonlit meditation across the piazza reveals that we continue walking not because we're lost, but because we've discovered purpose in each step, a quiet kindness toward ourselves and others who share life's inevitable sorrows.